Elvis Presley was at a crossroads, and it wasn't a pretty sight. The year was 1961, and the king of rock and roll was singing songs that felt more like lullabies for the elderly. It was a far cry from the electrifying performances that had made him a household name just a few years earlier. Imagine this: Elvis, the man who once shook the world with Heartbreak Hotel and Hound Dog, was now crooning lines like, "It's a wonderful life. This life I'm living, it's a wonderful life, living the life I love." It was as if the spark that had made him a legend had been doused in a bucket of cold water. The lyrics were so repetitive and simplistic that they seemed more like a nursery rhyme than a song for the king. Take, for instance, the movie Follow That Dream. The film's soundtrack was a mix of forgettable tunes, with the only real standout being Angel, a ballad that, while well arranged, was overshadowed by the soaring vocals of Millie Kirkham. Elvis tried his best, but even his voice couldn't salvage the lackluster material. The other songs on the soundtrack were just as disappointing. I'm Not the Marrying Kind was a clunker, with lyrics that were more confusing than romantic. Sound Advice was a bit better, with a folky acoustic sound and some amusing lyrics, but it still fell short of the emotional depth that Elvis had shown in songs like Little Sister and That's Someone You Never Forget. Even the Billboard magazine, which usually had a soft spot for Elvis, couldn't ignore the decline. They described the songs as 4 fine sides, but that was a generous assessment at best. The fact that the EP was so short only added to the disappointment. Fans felt cheated, and critics were starting to wonder what had happened to the man who once set the world on fire. The film itself didn't fare much better. While some reviewers praised Elvis's performance, calling it more nuanced and natural, others were less kind. Howard Thompson in the New York Times compared Follow That Dream to cornmeal mush, and suggested that Blue Hawaii had been caviar in comparison. The New York Times also took issue with Elvis's exposed torso and the repeated appearance of an outdoor restroom, which seemed more out of place than anything else. But it wasn't just the critics who were worried. Elvis himself knew he was at a crossroads. In an interview with Hedda Hopper, he admitted, "My fans are more adult now. Some of them are married and others are in college. They're still for me, of course, but what about the teenagers? They're the ones who went for rock and roll, and they're the ones who keep the records rolling. I've got to make good as a movie actor if I want to stay on top." Elvis's concerns were valid. The music industry was changing, and he was struggling to keep up. His songs were becoming more and more bland, and his performances, while still charming, lacked the raw energy and emotion that had made him a legend. The studio sessions of 1961 only reinforced this trend. On October 15, 1961, Elvis recorded, for the millionth and the last time, a Latin American ballad that was as forgettable as its title. The song was a pale imitation of the sophisticated works of composers like Antonio Carlos Jobim. Instead of embracing the rich, soulful music of the genre, Elvis was stuck with a song that sounded out of date even when it was recorded. The single Good Luck Charm was a bit better, but it still felt manufactured and lacked the emotional depth that had defined Elvis's best work. Billboard described it as a bright, medium-tempo rocker, but it was more like a generic pop song that could have been sung by any number of teen idols of the era. The B-side, Anything That's Part of You, was a more touching ballad, but it was relegated to the shadows by the more commercial aside. The other songs from the session, like I Met Her Today and Night Rider, continued the trend of bland, uninspired material. Even the songs that weren't released immediately, like I Met Her Today, which finally appeared on Elvis for Everyone, couldn't hide the fact that Elvis was struggling to find his musical identity. The situation didn't improve much with the next studio session, on October 26 to 27, 1961. Kid Galahad, a movie about a singing prizefighter, seemed like a strange choice, and the film itself was more of a featherweight than a heavyweight. Reviews were mixed, with some praising Elvis's charm and others questioning whether he had what it took to be a serious actor. The soundtrack for Kid Galahad was more of the same. The songs were pleasant enough, but they lacked the spark that had made Elvis a legend. The movie's theme song, a whistling tune, was so forgettable that it was cut from the film and only appeared years later on a compilation album. Elvis's musical journey was taking a turn, and the road ahead was uncertain. The king was at a crossroads, and the future of his career hung in the balance. What would come next was anyone's guess, but one thing was clear. the world was watching and the stakes were higher than ever. Elvis's album for the movie, Kid Galahad, shows a bit more effort and creativity compared to his earlier film soundtrack, Follow That Dream. The standout track is King of the Whole Wide World. Elvis really goes all out here, and you can hear the grit in his voice, which had been missing for a while. The song is a strong rock and roll number, and it's a shame it was only released on an EP. It would have made a great single. The unedited version, which finally came out in the 1990s, is even better, giving the song an extra punch. Home is Where the Heart is another highlight. It's a beautiful ballad with lyrics by Hal David, who later collaborated with Burt Bacharach. Elvis took 21 takes to get it right, showing he was still putting in the effort. This song could have easily been a standout on his next regular album, Potluck, and added some much-needed depth. The other songs on the Kid Galahad soundtrack are a bit more lightweight. I Got Lucky, Riding the Rainbow, and This Is Living all have a similar theme and sound a lot like each other. They're catchy and cheerful, but they blend together. A Whistling Tune is another pleasant but forgettable track, and it didn't add much to the album. In March 1962, Elvis went back to the studio to finish his Potluck album and record a few more singles. The session started strong with Something Blue, a ballad with a unique lyric about wedding traditions. Elvis and his band, especially Floyd Kramer, did a great job with this one. It had depth and a great arrangement. However, not all the ballads were as successful. Just for old time's sake, and I Feel That I've Known You Forever, felt outdated and corny. These songs sounded like they were from a different era, and didn't fit the 1962 music scene. Despite this, Elvis still gave them his best, making them pleasant to listen to, even if they weren't memorable. Fountain of Love is another ballad with a Latin rhythm, but it's not the best example of the genre. Elvis's vocal range is impressive, but the song itself is forgettable. Gonna Get Back Home Somehow is a standout up-tempo track with a dark, moody feel. Elvis's vocal is amazing, and the arrangement is well thought out, making it a highlight of the session. Easy Question is a ballad where Elvis adds a bluesy touch to his phrasing. It's not the best song, but it's appealing and more commercial than some of the others. Suspicion is another track that many fans love, especially in the UK. Elvis's performance is good, but the song lacks the hook and emotional depth that made his earlier hits so special. The singles from this session include She's Not You, a pop shuffle song with lyrics about missing an ex-girlfriend. It's a hit, but it lacks the passion and emotion that should come with the story. Just Tell Her Jim Said Hello is a more interesting track with a unique melody and angle on the end of an affair story. Elvis gives a great performance, but the final version is a bit too safe. The best song from the session, You'll Be Gone, was held back for 3 years. It's a dramatic Latin-themed song with a melody that's more engaging than Elvis's other attempts in this style. Elvis's vocal is powerful, alternating between tender and almost operatic, making it one of the more successful recordings from this period. Despite the quality of some tracks, the Potluck album was a bit of a letdown. The songs were mostly new, but they weren't better for it. The album lacked the substance and variety of his earlier work. The release decisions were also strange, with some strong tracks left off and weaker ones included. Critics still praised the album, but it didn't perform as well as hoped. Elvis's next film, Girls, 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 was a rehash of the Blue Hawaii formula. The film was set in Hawaii and had a mix of Elvis, girls, and songs. However, it was too long and poorly paced. The soundtrack was better than the film, with a nice mix of styles, but it had too many slow songs and felt padded. Elvis's voice was beautiful, but the material was often trite and repetitive. I Don't Want To is a pretty ballad, but the lyrics are simple. Where Do You Come From is a better track, with a dramatic bridge and a bit more depth. Because of Love is weaker, with Elvis sounding hesitant and running out of breath. The session showed signs that Elvis wasn't as committed as usual, and the number of takes required for each song was lower than in the past. Overall, these sessions and albums from 1962 highlight Elvis's artistic decline. While his voice was still beautiful, the material and decisions made were holding him back. Despite this, there were still moments of brilliance, and fans continued to support him. Elvis Presley's film, A Girl Like You, A Boy Like Me, featured a soundtrack with a mix of ballads and upbeat songs. The ballads, like A Boy Like Me, A Girl Like You, stood out for their melodic charm and interesting chord progressions. Elvis delivered a heartfelt performance, especially in lines like, "There would be this magic moment, one to last a lifetime through," making it a standout track. On the other hand, Earth Boy was a song with a Chinese influence and a unique sound, but the lyrics, written in pidgin English, made it uncomfortable to listen to. Despite its issues, it worked better in the film, where Elvis sang with children in a scene that, while not his best, was part of the movie's charm. Another ballad, Song of the Shrimp, told a quirky tale about a shrimp in the big city. The song was catchy and Elvis sang it straight, showing his versatility. Fans had mixed feelings about it, but it was a memorable track. Mama and We'll Be Together were both written for the same scene in the movie. Mama had a Neapolitan feel and was brief, while We'll Be Together was more substantial and had a Spanish flavor. Elvis's version was faster, but still captured the song's beauty, much like his earlier hit, No More from Blue Hawaii. The title song, a cover of a Labor and Stoller tune, was originally a novelty hit by the Coasters. Elvis and his band turned it into a fun rock pop number, though it was a bit repetitive. Return to Sender by Otis Blackwell and Winfield Scott became a big hit, reaching #2 in the US charts. The song blended rock, pop, and soul, showcasing Elvis's ability to cross genres. Two of the most interesting tracks were We're Common and Loaded, and Thanks to the Rolling Sea. These songs sounded like traditional work songs, and fit well with the folk revival of the time. Elvis's a cappella version of Thanks to the Rolling Sea, released later, was a hidden gem that highlighted his vocal talent. The Walls Have Ears was a tango-inspired song with silly lyrics, but Elvis's playful performance made it enjoyable. The Rockers, however, were less successful. I Don't Wanna Be Tied had moments of promise but lacked the fire of Elvis's earlier rock hits. Plantation Rock was one of the weakest rock songs he recorded, and it was cut from the film and delayed for release. The film itself received mixed reviews. Critics noted the thin plot and lack of chemistry between Elvis and his co-star, Stella Stevens. The soundtrack, while not bad, was repetitive and sometimes dull, especially with the emphasis on ballads. For his next film, It Happened at the World's Fair, Elvis recorded 10 songs over 2 sessions. The soundtrack was shorter and had sound quality issues. Take Me to the Fair was another bland Tepper and Bennett song, but it worked better on record than in the film. Relax was a rehash of Fever, and while Elvis tried to make it work, it fell short. Don Robertson contributed 2 beautiful ballads, I'm Falling in Love Tonight, and They Remind Me Too Much of You. The latter was a standout, with Elvis's tender, whisper-like performance. However, it was released as a B-side, and didn't get the attention it deserved. One Broken Heart for Sale was a brief derivative song that didn't connect with audiences. The single stalled at #11 in the charts, signaling that fans wanted more from Elvis. The soundtrack also included 2 children's songs. How Would You Like to Be was tedious and overlong, while Cotton Candy Land was a dark, effective lullaby. Beyond the Bend was a bright but empty song, and A World of Our Own was a weak imitation of a Don Robertson ballad. Happy Ending was a mediocre song with Elvis in poor voice, struggling with the low notes. The album and film received little attention and mixed reviews. Critics felt the film was a parody of old MGM musicals, and lacked the humor and character of Elvis's better work. Elvis's film career was hitting a rough patch in the early 1960s. Movies like Girls, 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 and It Happened at the World's Fair were polished and professional, but they lacked the fun and energy of his earlier films like Blue Hawaii and GI Blues. Even though these later films were considered some of the dullest of his career, they still managed to entertain audiences because they were so bad, they were good. Elvis's next few films, Fun in Acapulco, Viva Las Vegas, and Roustabout, brought back some of the fun and energy that fans had been missing. However, it wasn't long before Elvis found himself on a production line, churning out one movie and soundtrack after another. Some people blamed Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, for this, while others pointed fingers at the studios. But an interview with Elvis by Lloyd Shearer on the set of It Happened at the World's Fair revealed that Elvis himself was partly to blame. He was content with the success he had, and didn't want to take any risks that might jeopardize it. Elvis told Shearer, "I've done 11 pictures and they've all made money. A certain type of audience likes me. I entertain them with what I'm doing. I'd be a fool to tamper with that kind of success." This attitude would later come back to haunt him. As the 1960s wore on, Elvis's appearances in the press became less frequent. He was giving fewer interviews, which contributed to his declining presence in the media. However, during the filming of It Happened at the World's Fair, Elvis was unusually talkative. He gave interviews to Lloyd Shearer, Robin Douglas Home, and Jane Ardmore. These interviews painted a picture of a man who was both a jokester and a deeply introspective individual. Robin Douglas Home, a British journalist, found it difficult to get access to Elvis, and when he finally did, Colonel Parker was always nearby. Despite this, Elvis revealed that his musical tastes were more diverse than just rock and roll. He enjoyed everything from classical music to modern jazz and even comedy albums. Douglas Home ended his article on a somber note, describing Elvis as a prisoner of his own talent. In contrast, Jane Ardmore's interview was more personal. Elvis spoke openly about the loss of his mother, a tragedy that had a profound impact on him. He said, "There are many times when life's difficult, such as tragedy, like the death of my mother. If I had to go through the rest of my life feeling the way I did then, I'd be better off dead. She was an angel, and nothing seemed right without her." He also talked about his faith, saying, "God gives you the strength." These interviews showed a side of Elvis that was rarely seen. He was a complex individual, full of contradictions. On one hand, he was a playful star, but on the other, he was a deeply emotional and thoughtful person. By 1963, the quality of Elvis's recordings was starting to decline, and this was reflected in both sales and reviews. Fans and consumers were willing to overlook 1 or 2 lackluster releases, but when they became the norm, people began to take notice. The quality improved a bit with Fun in Acapulco and Viva Las Vegas, but it was mostly downhill from there. In January 1963, Elvis recorded the soundtrack for Fun in Acapulco. The film and its music were enjoyable, thanks to the Mexican theme that allowed Elvis to explore his love for Latin rhythms. Songs like Bossa Nova Baby and Margarita showcased his ability to have fun and deliver strong performances. Even the more whimsical tracks like The Bullfighter Was a Lady had their charm. However, not all the songs were hits. Guadalajara, sung in Spanish, was a bit clumsy, and No Room to Roomba in a Sports Car was pure kitsch. Despite this, the soundtrack was still enjoyable, and critics were kind to both the film and Elvis. Howard Thompson of the New York Times praised Elvis, saying he had never looked so relaxed on screen. In May 1963, Elvis recorded more material for a new album, but the results were mixed. Songs like Echoes of Love were lackluster, and the album was never released. Instead, the songs were used as bonus tracks on soundtrack albums and B-sides. Despite the ups and downs, Fun in Acapulco and Viva Las Vegas were bright spots in Elvis's career, bringing back the energy and fun that had been missing. These films and their soundtracks helped to reinvigorate his career, at least for a little while. Elvis and the band seemed to have woken up on Please Don't Drag That String Around. This song has a lively feel and follows the sound of One Broken Heart for Sale, even though that single didn't do well on the charts. Please Don't Drag That String Around is a better song and performance, but it feels like Elvis and the musicians expected more from the songwriters Blackwell and Scott. The chorus is catchy, but the lyrics mix elements from Teddy Bear and Wear My Ring Around Your Neck. The arrangement lacks a build-up or a climax, which would have made it more engaging. Devil in Disguise was a big hit and brought Elvis back to the top 10 after One Broken Heart for Sale. This song was perfect for radio, with its memorable switches between slow and fast tempos. Elvis sings it brilliantly, using his soft voice for the slow parts and a more powerful voice for the choruses. The song was even used in a film called Scorpio Rising without permission, which added to its mystique. Never Ending was one of Elvis's best Latin-flavored songs. Unlike some of his earlier attempts, this one had a strong melody that grew in each verse. Elvis gave a smooth and well-judged performance, making it one of his closest sounds to Sam Cooke. The chorus, which repeats the song's title, is a bit of a letdown, but Elvis's voice elevates the entire number. What Now, What Next, Where To could have been a reflection of Elvis's career at the time. It's a medium-paced ballad with a country touch, but it's not very memorable. The songwriters, Don Robertson and Hal Blair, seemed to be running out of fresh ideas. The recording session felt a bit rushed, with many songs completed in just a few takes. Out of the 12 songs recorded, 8 were finished in under 5 takes. This shows that the songs were often bland and didn't require much effort. Finders Keep's Losers Weepers has a similar feel to What Now, What Next, Where To. Elvis's performances are good, but the songs themselves are forgettable. The sessions seem to lack the energy and creativity of previous recordings. The fault lies with the unremarkable songs Elvis was choosing to record. Witchcraft was a song that had been recorded 8 years earlier by a lesser-known group called the Spiders. Elvis's version is a great example of his ability to transform a song. He added a contemporary twist and a seductive touch, making it a cross between Fever and Such a Night. While it's not as good as those classics, it shows what Elvis could do with better material. Love Me Tonight is a ballad by Don Robertson that sounds like a diluted version of There's Always Me. Elvis gives a beautiful performance, but the song lacks impact. Slowly but Surely has a feel similar to Put the Blame on Me. Both songs are decent, but lean too much on past successes. Western Union has lyrics that seem like a copy of Return to Sender. The song is about unanswered letters and phone calls, but Elvis's serious performance makes it appealing despite its cliched content. Long Lonely Highway is a darker song by Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller. The lyrics touch on themes of death and suicide, but Elvis's performance misses the dark undertones. The upbeat tempo and lack of menace in his voice make it seem lighter than its content suggests. Some songs from the session were left unfinished. Ask Me and Memphis, Tennessee were set aside after just 2 takes and later re-recorded. Blue River was released as a B-side but was poorly mixed, covering Elvis's vocal and distortion. The session was a mix of good and bad, but it showed that Elvis could still deliver when he put his mind to it. The reputation of the film Viva Las Vegas has grown over the years. Howard Thompson's review in the New York Times called it pleasant and unimportant, but by 1964, Elvis films were being welcomed more openly. The chemistry between Elvis and Anne Margaret was a highlight, but the film had its faults, especially the rushed ending. The title song, Viva Las Vegas, was a B-side in the US but an A-side in the UK, where it reached #17. The song has an infectious, party-like vibe, and became a signature track for Elvis. The A-side, What I Say, is a cover of Ray Charles's song, but it's chaotic and lacks the soul of the original. Elvis's live performances of the song varied, sometimes extending it, and sometimes reducing it to a snippet. Nightlife is a bluesy number that pays tribute to Vegas, with Elvis's laid-back vocal and Billy Strange's guitar work bringing it to life. Come On Everybody is a weak rock and roll number that tries to inject excitement but falls flat. If You Think I Don't Need You has a Ray Charles feel but is only average. Elvis's higher register gives it a whining sound that isn't very appealing. The best song in the soundtrack is I Need Somebody to Lean On, a torch song by Doc Pomus and Mort Schumann. Elvis's performance, accompanied by a small trio, is a rare flirtation with jazz. The film sequence is striking, with Elvis not singing but the song playing over the scene as an interior monologue. The 2 ballads, Santa Lucia and Can't Help Falling in Love, are based on classical pieces. Santa Lucia is a traditional Neapolitan song with a simple acoustic backing. Elvis gets ahead of the beat halfway through, but it's a pleasant song overall. Can't Help Falling in Love is a beautiful ballad that has become one of Elvis's most beloved songs, with its romantic lyrics and timeless melody. Elvis's performance of Today, Tomorrow, and Forever is a standout. The song, inspired by Franz Liszt's Liebestraum, showcases Elvis's more restrained and nuanced side. While his vibrato occasionally wavers, it adds a touch of raw emotion to the track. The duet version with Anne Margaret was ultimately shelved, and it's for the best. Anne's voice, though talented, clashes with Elvis's subtle delivery and detracts from the song's charm. On the other hand, the duet The Lady Loves Me is a fun, if slightly long, comedy song. The chemistry between Elvis and Anne Margaret is evident, especially when you see them together in the film. The playful lyrics and the song's light-hearted nature make it enjoyable, even if the punchline doesn't quite land outside the movie's context. You're the Boss is perhaps the best duet between Elvis and Anne Margaret. Ernst Jorgensen describes it as wonderfully seductive, and it's hard to disagree. The song is a masterclass in restraint, with both singers delivering a performance that feels intimate and engaging. It's a shame this track remained unreleased for nearly 3 decades. Moving back to Elvis's solo numbers, Do the Vega is a light-hearted attempt to create a new dance craze. While it's not the strongest track, it's surprisingly enjoyable. Unfortunately, it's a sign of the declining quality control in Elvis's music. The medley of The Yellow Rose of Texas and The Eyes of Texas is another weak point. It starts off okay, but quickly devolves into a chaotic, drunken-sounding performance that doesn't stand on its own outside the film. Despite its flaws, the Viva Las Vegas soundtrack has more good than bad, which makes it puzzling why it wasn't released as a full album. Instead, the songs were scattered across singles, EPs, and budget albums, denying fans a complete collection of the film's music. The next phase of Elvis's career saw him recording for the film Kissin Cousins. Critics were harsh, with Howard Thompson of the New York Times exclaiming, "For Pete's sake, El," and calling the film tired, strained, and familiar. The film's director, Gene Nelson, was a reliable but not particularly creative director, and it shows in the final product. Once Is Enough is one of the few standout tracks from the Kissin Cousins soundtrack. It's an upbeat, energetic song that Elvis sings with enthusiasm, though the lyrics are cliched. Catchin' On Fast is another attempt at an upbeat track, but it's bland and forgettable, with Elvis struggling to keep in tune. Elvis's ballads on this soundtrack are a mixed bag. Anyone is a quiet, unassuming song that Elvis delivers well, though it's not particularly memorable. Tender Feeling, based on the traditional Shenandoah, has a strong melody but is marred by jarring instrumentation. One Boy, Two Little Girls is a sappy ballad that sounds out of place with Elvis singing about being a boy in love with little girls. Kissin' Cousins and Kissin' Cousins No. 2 are rock and roll numbers that feel out of place in 1963. The novelty of Elvis duetting with himself doesn't make up for the lackluster songwriting. Smoky Mountain Boy is a march-like ditty that's utterly forgettable, and There's Gold in the Mountains is even worse, with grating female vocals that drown out Elvis's performance. Barefoot Ballad is a bizarre country song with a focus on toes and Elvis's mock Tennessee twang, making it one of the most embarrassing tracks he ever recorded. The nadir of Elvis's career so far, the Kissin' Cousins soundtrack is a collection of bland, ridiculous songs. Despite this, Elvis's label, RCA, continued to promote the album, claiming it featured fine work from the singer. However, by 1964, Elvis's relevance in the music industry was waning, and he was barely mentioned in music magazines. A 1964 article in Variety shed light on the driving force behind Elvis's endless string of movies, money. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, was quoted as saying, "Look, you got a product, you sell it. As long as the studios come up with the loot, we'll make the deal." Parker's focus was on profit, not artistry. He was content to churn out low-quality films as long as they made money, even rejecting scripts that could have won Elvis an Oscar. On January 12, 1964, Elvis recorded 3 of his best tracks since 1960. Memphis, Tennessee is a powerful, rhythmic cover of Chuck Berry's song. Elvis's higher register and emotive storytelling make it a compelling listen. Ask Me, a ballad based on an Italian song, showcases Elvis's smooth vocal style and reached #12 on the charts. The highlight, however, is It Hurts Me, a soulful ballad that demonstrates Elvis's incredible vocal range and emotional depth. Despite the song's quality, it's a reminder of the wasted potential in Elvis's career, as he was often forced to perform subpar material. Elvis recorded some amazing songs in January 1964, but unfortunately, they didn't get the attention they deserved. It Hurts Me is a standout, but it ended up as the B-side of Kissin' Cousins. Ask Me and Memphis, Tennessee were also fantastic, but they didn't get the exposure they should have. After this session, Elvis didn't record any non-soundtrack music for over 2 years. The reason for this is a bit of a mystery. Some say it was because he was too busy with movies, but that doesn't quite add up. Elvis had shown before that he could record a lot of songs in just a few nights. Another theory is that there was no room in the release schedule for new music. But the release of Elvis for Everyone in 1965 shows that there was room for new material. The decline in the quality and popularity of both non-soundtrack and soundtrack albums around this time might have played a role. However, RCA could have still released some quality singles. It's also possible that Elvis needed time to figure out his next move. He had changed his music style before, like when he returned from the army. During this break, he spent a lot of time at home, playing and singing a wide range of songs. This eventually led to the How Great Thou Art sessions in 1966, which marked a new phase in his career. Despite the quality of his earlier recordings, Elvis's music was becoming less relevant. The British invasion, led by the Beatles, only made this more obvious. But even before the Beatles, Elvis's music had started to lose its edge. In March, April, and May of 1964, Elvis recorded the soundtrack for Roustabout. Surprisingly, the album hit #1 in the US, partly because it was the first album after the successful Viva Las Vegas, which had no soundtrack. The film itself was better than some of his other movies. It had a better plot, and Elvis's character was more developed. Critics generally liked it, even if some found it a bit over the top. The title track is a fun, upbeat song, but the mix makes Elvis's voice hard to hear. Another song, I'm a Roustabout, was recorded but never released until much later. It had a cool, edgier feel but didn't flow well. Poison Ivy League showed that Elvis's vocal quality wasn't as strong as it had been earlier in the year. It's a Wonderful World and Wheels on My Heels were decent, but the latter was way too short. One Track Heart and Hard Knocks were a return to rock and roll, but they felt more like fun pastiches than serious efforts. Big Love, Big Heartache was a weak ballad, and There's a Brand New Day on the Horizon was a reworked version of an old tune. The album had a few carnival-themed songs, but they were forgettable. There are still some mysteries about these sessions. For example, I'm a Roustabout was recorded but not used, and there's a hint that another song might have been recorded and discarded. The film and soundtrack didn't really reflect what was popular in music at the time, and Elvis was becoming more associated with the past. In June 1964, Elvis recorded the soundtrack for Girl Happy. The title track was bland and uninspiring, and it was sped up for release, which made it sound silly. Spring Fever had a weak melody, and Fort Lauderdale Chamber of Commerce had a nice tune but a poor recording. Startin' Tonight was one of the worst, with Elvis barely singing and just shouting through the chorus. The quality of the soundtrack was low, and it showed that Elvis's non-soundtrack music was suffering even more. Despite the poor quality of these recordings, Elvis's film career was still doing well. Roustabout and Girl Happy were both successful at the box office, and Elvis was still a big star. But the music was falling behind, and it would take a few years for Elvis to find his way back to relevance. Elvis's career in the mid-1960s was a mix of good and bad. He was still a big star, making lots of money, but the quality of his movies and music was not always top-notch. His 1965 film, Girl Happy, was a step down from his earlier hits like Roustabout and Viva Las Vegas, but it still had its moments. The movie was colorful and lively, with Elvis delivering some catchy tunes, but the songs were often just okay, and the plot was pretty silly. Songs like Wolf Call and Do the Clam were fun but not exactly groundbreaking. Despite the mediocre quality of the music, Elvis still managed to charm his audience. Cross My Heart and Hope to Die and Puppet on a String stood out as some of the better tracks, with a smoky nightclub feel that showed Elvis could still deliver a good vocal when he wanted to. Even the New York Times, which had once been critical of Elvis, seemed to be rooting for him to do better. The reviewer encouraged Elvis to send us a better one next time. Elvis's manager, Colonel Parker, was more interested in making money than in creating high-quality art. He famously said, "For the kind of money they're paying us, we can leave the problem of making pictures to them. All Elvis has to do is be there on time, he is. This attitude showed that the focus was more on profit than on artistic integrity. However, some people, like director Norman Taurog, believed that Elvis had the potential to be a great actor if given the right roles. Taurog even suggested that Elvis could play a cold-blooded killer, but Parker would never go for it. Elvis's next film, Tickle Me, was another formulaic movie that, despite its poor quality, still made money at the box office. The songs in Tickle Me were mostly lip-synced from earlier recordings, which didn't help the film's reputation. Critics were not kind, but the fans still came out to see Elvis, and he continued to be a top earner in Hollywood. In February 1965, Elvis recorded the soundtrack for Harum Scarum, a movie that was even more forgettable than Girl Happy. The film's plot was absurd, and Elvis's performance was described as lacking energy. The soundtrack album started with Harim Holiday, a song so out of tune that it sounded like a rehearsal. My Desert Serenade and Kismet were better, but still not great. Shake That Tambourine and Hey Little Girl had some energy, but they didn't quite live up to Elvis's best work. Despite the mixed quality of his output, Elvis was still a major star. He was making more money than ever, but it was becoming clear that his artistic growth was being stunted. The combination of Parker's focus on profit and Elvis's own lack of ambition meant that his career was stuck in a rut. By the end of 1965, it was evident that something needed to change if Elvis was going to find new heights in his music and acting.